every day. He walked the same roads, but no one ever asked where his journey truly began. If you are listening at night, tell me where you are and what time it is. Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories, where we tell slow and gentle tallies from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. The night feels quiet and wide, as if the world has decided to pause for a moment. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a town sleeps beneath a sky that holds no hurry. Roofs rest under the weight of centuries of dust and weather. Streets lie still, remembering footsteps that passed long ago. In this quiet space, it becomes easy to notice things that usually remain unseen, like the slow rhythm of human lives moving through time. Far back in the medieval world, before clocks ruled the hours and machines shaped the day, mornings arrived gently. The light did not burst into existence. It slipped across stone walls and wooden beams with patience. In one such town, near a river that curved lazily through fields and forests, a merchant began another ordinary day. He did not think of himself. As important, he did not imagine history watching him. He simply rose from a narrow bed in a modest house, where the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and old fabric. Outside, the town was still half asleep. A dog stirred somewhere. A rooster tested its voice, unsure whether the morning had fully arrived. The merchant moved slowly. His hands knew the familiar motions of dressing, of tying worn leather shoes, of smoothing a cloak that had seen many journeys. His life was shaped not by dramatic events, but by repetition. The same streets, the same markets, the same roads that led out of town and returned again, season after season. He stepped outside, and the cool air touched his face. Stone buildings leaned toward one another across narrow lanes, as if sharing secrets. Windows remained dark, except for a few faint glows where bakers had already begun their work. The merchant walked past them quietly, listening to the soft crackle of ovens and the dull scrape of wooden tools. He carried no weapons and no grand plans. Instead, he carried lists in his mind, cloth from distant towns, salt from the coast, spices that traveled across seas and deserts before reaching his hands. These were not treasures in a heroic sense. They were ordinary goods, yet they connected faraway places in ways most people never noticed. As he walked, the town slowly awakened. A door opened. A man stepped out, rubbing his eyes. Somewhere, a bucket hit water in a well. The sounds were small, almost shy, but together they formed the beginning of a day. The merchant nodded to people he recognized. They nodded back. No words were necessary. Familiarity did the work of language. The marketplace waited at the center of town, an open space shaped by countless footsteps. During the day, it would become crowded and noisy, filled with voices and bargaining and laughter. But in this early hour, it felt wide and empty, like a stage before actors arrive. Wooden stalls stood quietly, their surfaces worn smooth by years. Of hands and goods, the merchant paused there for a moment. He looked around, not with excitement, but with calm attention. He had seen this place thousands of times, yet it never felt exactly the same. Weather changed, people changed, goods changed, and beneath those changes, something steady remained, like a slow heartbeat of trade and routine. He remembered journeys he had taken before, roads stretching through forests where sunlight filtered through leaves, bridges crossing rivers that murmured endlessly. villages where strangers offered bread and questions in equal measure. None of these memories felt dramatic. They felt like threads in a long fabric, woven so gradually that no one could point to the exact moment when the pattern appeared in his mind. Distance was not measured in miles, but in days of walking and riding. He thought of horses that had carried him over muddy roads, of carts that creaked under heavy loads, of inns where travelers shared stories that blurred truth and imagination. The merchant listened to such stories politely, rarely correcting them. Truth and exaggeration often mattered less than comfort. Soon, other merchants arrived. They greeted him with slow smiles and casual gestures. These were people who understood waiting. They understood that profit came not from sudden brilliance, but from patience. They arranged their goods quietly, laying out cloth, jars, bundles of herbs, metal tools, and small objects whose purposes were known only to certain buyers. As the sun climbed a little higher, colors began to emerge. Browns of wood, grays of stone, faded reds and blues of dyed fabric. The merchant touched the cloth he had brought, feeling its texture between his fingers. It was neither perfect nor rare, but it was reliable. Reliability, he had learned, was more valuable than spectacle. He watched people pass through the square, farmers bringing baskets of vegetables, craftsmen carrying tools, children chasing each other in lazy circles. A priest walked slowly, his robe brushing the ground. Each person carried a life that felt ordinary to them, yet each life was quietly shaped by trade, by goods that had traveled unseen paths. The merchant did not think of himself as a hero of commerce. He thought of himself as someone who moved things from one place to another. Yet in that simple movement, entire worlds touched. A spice from a distant land changed the taste of a local meal. A piece of cloth altered the way someone felt about their own appearance. A metal tool made a farmer's work slightly easier. Time passed in a way that felt almost invisible. The merchant spoke with customers in calm voices. He listened more than he talked. He learned to read faces, to sense hesitation, to recognize when someone wanted to buy and when someone simply wanted to touch and imagine. There was no rush. The day was long, and tomorrow would come, regardless of what happened today. As the market slowly filled, the merchant felt a familiar sense of belonging. Not excitement, not ambition, but something quieter. He was part of a rhythm, older than he could remember and larger than he could understand. Goods would arrive. Goods would leave. Coins would change hands. Roads would continue to stretch across the land. Above the town, the sky remained vast and indifferent. Clouds drifted without purpose. Birds crossed invisible paths. The merchant glanced upward briefly, then returned his attention to the store before him. His world was not the sky. His world was the slow exchange of objects and moments, the gentle flow of everyday trade. And as the morning settled into itself, the medieval town breathed softly around him, carrying forward the quiet life of a merchant who will never imagine that centuries later, someone might pause to notice how calmly he once stood in the light. The morning continued without urgency, as if time itself had learned to move gently in this town. The merchant remained at his stall, not standing rigidly, not sitting fully at rest, but existing somewhere in between. His posture was shaped by habit rather than intention. He had learned that trade did not reward haste. It rewarded presence. A Woman approached his stall with slow steps. Her hands were rough from work in the fields, her eyes thoughtful rather than curious. She touched a piece of cloth lightly, as if testing not only its texture but its meaning. The merchant watched her hands without interrupting. He understood that silence often made people feel safer than words. They spoke eventually, but softly. Their conversation was not dramatic. It was made of small phrases, pauses, and nods. Coins passed from her hand to his. The cloth folded itself into her basket. Nothing extraordinary happened, yet something subtle shifted in the shape of her. The merchant noticed this, though he did not name it. When she left, he adjusted the remaining goods. He liked order, not because it impressed anyone, but because it calmed his thoughts. Objects arranged neatly seemed easier to understand than the world beyond the market. The world beyond was full of uncertainty. Roads could flood. Bandits could appear. Prices could change without warning. Order, even temporary order, felt comforting. He remembered his first journey beyond the town. He had been younger then, his steps lighter, his mind louder. The road had felt endless. Trees had seemed taller, shadows deeper. Every unfamiliar sound had felt significant. Over time, the sounds had become familiar companions. The creak of wheels, the rhythm of hooves, the distant call of birds. Fear had slowly softened into routine. Travel taught him patience. When carts broke down, there was no quick solution. When rain fell, it did not ask permission. When night arrived, it did not wait for travelers to reach safety. The merchant learned to accept delays as part of the landscape. Waiting became as natural as walking. Sometimes he traveled alone, sometimes with other merchants. Conversations during these journeys rarely stayed focused. One moment they discussed prices, the next they spoke of weather, then of childhood memories, then of rumors about distant cities. Truth and imagination blended so quietly that separating them felt unnecessary. He remembered an old man he once met on a road near a forest. The man had claimed to have seen cities made entirely of stone so white they seemed unreal. The merchant had listened politely. He never knew whether the story was true. It did not matter. The image stayed with him, hovering in his mind like a gentle echo. Back in the marketplace, the days slowly grew warmer. Shadows shortened. Voices became slightly louder. The merchant noticed changes without reacting strongly. He felt them the way one feels the movement of air on skin, present but not demanding. A boy approached his stall with hesitant curiosity. The boy's eyes wandered over the goods, drawn not by necessity but by wonder. The merchant allowed him to look without pressure. Children, he had learned, often saw possibilities where adults saw only prices. The boy picked up a small metal object, turned it in his hands, then carefully placed it back. The merchant smiled faintly, not at the boy alone, but at the quiet continuity of life. Boys would grow into men. Men would become merchants, farmers, travelers. Goods would move. Stories would move. Nothing would stay exactly the same, yet nothing would change too suddenly. Behind the market, the river flowed with steady indifference. Barges sometimes carried goods along its surface, moving more slowly than birds, but more steadily than people. The merchant liked watching the river when he had a moment to spare. Water seemed to understand time better than humans did. It never rushed, yet it always arrived somewhere. He wondered occasionally how far his goods traveled after leaving his hands. Cloth might pass through many markets before resting in a distant home. Salt might dissolve into meals he would never taste. Spices might change dishes in cities he would never see. These thoughts did not excite him. They simply existed, like quiet companions. The merchant's own life felt similar. He moved through towns and roads, touching lives briefly, leaving traces that would fade quickly. Most people would forget him. He would forget most people. Yet something invisible connected them all, like threads too to see. As noon approached, he ate a small meal beside his stall. Bread, cheese, a piece of fruit. The act of eating was simple, uncelebrated. He did not think of it as a break. It was just another movement within the day. Nearby, other merchants did the same, chewing quietly. Watching the crowd without urgency, a distant bell rang from a church tower. Its sound drifted across rooftops, neither loud nor soft, but persistent. The merchant listened without stopping what he was doing. Bells marked time, but they did not control it. Life continued whether bells rang or not. He thought of seasons. In winter, roads became difficult. In spring, mud slowed carts. In summer, heat tired animals and people alike. In autumn, harvest filled markets with abundance. Each season changed the rhythm of trade slightly, like variations in a familiar melody. He felt no need to escape this rhythm. Some people dreamed of dramatic journeys or sudden wealth. The merchant dreamed of predictability. He wanted roads that remained open, customers who returned, goods that sold steadily. Stability felt like a quiet form of success. As the sun climbed higher, the merchant's shadow shrank beneath him. He noticed it without reflection. Shadows came and went. Markets filled and emptied. Days began and ended. Within these cycles, his own presence felt small but steady. And in the middle of the ordinary noise of trade, footsteps, voices, and distant bells, the merchant continued to stand quietly, observing without urgency, as if he belonged not only to the town, but to time itself. The afternoon unfolded slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the day itself did not wish to move forward too quickly. The merchant felt the hours not as numbers, but as subtle shifts in light and sound. The air grew softer, then warmer, then softer again. People's voices changed tone without anyone noticing the change. He watched the marketplace from within, it never fully stepping outside its rhythm. Customers came and went. Some lingered, touching objects, without buying anything. Others arrived with purpose, exchanged a few words, and left with goods wrapped in cloth or tucked into baskets. The merchant did not judge their movements. He accepted them as he accepted weather. Occasionally, he felt a faint tiredness in his legs. He shifted his weight, adjusted his cloak, and remained where he was. There was no dramatic moment when he decided to continue. Continuation was simply the natural state of things. Stopping would have required more effort than staying. He thought again of roads, of mornings when he had woken beside a cart, dew settling quietly on leather and wood, of evenings when he had watched the sun disappear behind hills, leaving the world briefly colorless before darkness arrived. On those roads, he had felt neither lonely nor accompanied. He had simply been present, moving forward with goods and thoughts that did not demand interpretation. Sometimes he wondered what his life would look like from a distance. Perhaps it would seem repetitive, Perhaps it would seem small. Yet from within, it felt neither repetitive nor small. Each day contained tiny variations, a different face, a slightly altered price, a new rumor. These variations were enough. The town itself seemed to breathe with him. Walls warmed under sunlight. Roof tiles held heat quietly. The river continued its slow conversation with stones. Even the air felt inhabited by memories. The merchant sensed that people before him had stood in this same square, touched similar goods, spoken similar words. He was not unique. He was part of a long sequence. As the market began to thin, the merchant packed some of his remaining goods with careful hands. He did not rush. There was no urgency in folding cloth or tying cords. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, though he would never have described them that way. He simply liked the feeling of completion that came with orderly gestures. Few merchants remained nearby, their voices lower now, their energy softened by the passing day. They exchanged casual remarks about prices, roads, and weather. None of them spoke of grand ambitions. Their conversations drifted like smoke, appearing briefly and dissolving into the air. The merchant felt a quiet satisfaction that did not resemble joy. It was closer to balance. He had sold some goods, kept others, learned a few small things, forgotten a few others. The day had not transformed him. It had merely carried him forward by a small, almost invisible distance. As he prepared to leave the marketplace, he paused once more and looked around. The square was not empty, but it was calmer. Shadows lengthened across stones. Footsteps became less frequent. The town was beginning its slow transition toward evening. He walked away from the stall with steady steps, not thinking of tomorrow in detail, not thinking of the past with nostalgia. He simply moved through familiar streets, past familiar doors and windows, carrying with him the quiet weight of a life that did not seek to be extraordinary. Above him, the sky continued its indifferent journey. Somewhere far beyond the town, other merchants were walking other roads, setting up other stalls, speaking other quiet words. The merchant did not know them, yet he felt connected to them in a way that did not require understanding. And as he disappeared into the narrow streets, the medieval town remained behind him, still breathing, still waiting, still holding the slow, unhurried rhythm of trade and time, ready to continue without interruption, as if nothing ever truly began and nothing ever truly ended. Morning returned without announcement. It did not knock on doors or call names. It simply arrived, as it always had, sliding quietly across rooftops and stones. The merchant woke before the town fully stirred, not because he had planned to, but because his body had learned the rhythm of days long ago. The room around him was still dim. Wooden beams stretched above his head, darkened by years of smoke and touch. The air held the faint scent of yesterday's fire and damp night air. He lay still for a moment, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a cart creaked. Somewhere closer, footsteps moved slowly along a street. These sounds felt familiar, almost comforting. He rose without haste. There was no sudden urgency waiting. For him, trade did not demand speed. It demanded endurance. He washed his hands with cool water from a clay bowl, feeling the slight shock of cold against his skin. The sensation anchored him in the present moment. Outside, the town was beginning to shift from sleep into activity. Doors opened one by one. Voices appeared softly, as if people were testing the weight of their own words. The merchant stepped into the street and felt the morning air wrap around him like a thin cloak. He walked toward the marketplace again, though today he would not remain there long. His mind was already moving beyond the town walls, toward roads that stretched outward, like quiet invitations. Today was a day of travel. Not a grand journey, not a heroic expedition, but one of many ordinary trips that shaped his life. Near the edge of town, his cart waited beside a patient horse. The animal stood calmly, head lowered, breathing slowly. The merchant touched its neck with gentle familiarity. He did not speak to it. Words felt unnecessary between beings who understood routine better than language. He checked the goods he would carry. Bundles of cloths, sacks of salt, small wooden boxes filled with items that had traveled far before reaching him. Each object had a history he barely knew. Each object would continue its journey after leaving his hands. He tied ropes carefully, not too tight, not too loose. Balance mattered more than perfection. As he prepared to leave, the town behind him felt both close and distant. He had lived within its walls for years, yet every departure made it seem slightly unreal, as if it were a place he borrowed rather than owned. He stepped onto the road with quiet acceptance. The road did not hurry him. It stretched forward with steady indifference. Trees lined parts of it, their branches forming loose arches overhead. In other places, open fields extended toward the horizon, dotted with slow-moving cattle and faint lines of fences. The merchant walked beside the cart, holding the reins loosely. The horse moved at an unhurried pace. Wheels turned with soft, repetitive sounds. The rhythm of movement felt older than thought itself. Step, breath, wheel, step. The pattern repeated without demanding attention. He noticed small details as he traveled. The way sunlight filtered through leaves, the way dust lifted briefly beneath hooves and then settled again, the way distant hills seemed to move only when one looked away and back again. None of these details felt important, yet together they formed the texture of his world. Occasionally, other travelers appeared on the road, a farmer leading a donkey, a pair of monks walking in quiet conversation, another merchant guiding a heavier cart. They exchanged nods or brief words. No one lingered long. Roads encouraged movement, not attachment. When he spoke with others, conversations unfolded slowly. People talked about weather, harvests, rumors from distant towns. Someone mentioned a market where prices had risen slightly. Someone else spoke of a bridge damaged by recent rain. The merchant listened carefully, storing information not with excitement, but with calm practicality. He thought about how roads connected places that might otherwise remain separate forever. Without roads, towns would become islands. With roads, they became parts of a larger, invisible network. He was one of the many small figures moving along that network, carrying objects and stories from one point to another. As the day advanced, the sun climbed higher. Heat settled gently on his shoulders. He loosened his cloak slightly, letting air touch his skin. The horse slowed a little, and he allowed it. There was no advantage in pushing speed. Arriving tired was worse than arriving late. At midday, he stopped near a cluster of trees beside a small stream. Water moved quietly over stones, creating sounds that felt older than words. He gave the horse time to drink, then sat on the grass. With his back against a trunk, he ate slowly, tasting bread without thinking about taste, while he rested. He watched insects move across leaves, watched shadows shift as clouds passed overhead. Time felt stretched, wide, almost empty. Yet within that emptiness, everything continued. The stream did not stop. The wind did not pause. His own breathing remained steady. He wondered briefly how many merchants had rested beside this same stream before him. Perhaps hundreds, perhaps thousands. Their names were forgotten, their faces erased by time, yet their pauses had shaped the road just as much as their journeys. After a while, he stood again, not because he felt fully rested, but because movement was part of his nature. He returned to the cart, adjusted the ropes once more, and resumed his slow progress along the road. Ahead, the landscape opened gradually. The road curved gently toward another town he had visited many times before. He did not anticipate anything unusual there. He expected familiar streets, familiar faces, familiar exchanges of goods and words. And as he walked, neither excited nor weary, the merchant felt himself dissolve quietly into the flow of travel, becoming less an individual and more a moving part of a long, patient system that had existed long before him and would continue long after he was gone. The road continued without surprise. It did not rise suddenly or fall dramatically. It curved gently, as if it had been shaped not by intention, but by long habits of feet and wheels. The merchant followed it with quiet trust. He did not expect the road to explain itself. As he moved forward, the air changed, almost imperceptibly. The scent of damp earth faded, replaced by the faint smell of distant fields and smoke. Somewhere far ahead, a town existed, though it was not yet visible. He felt its presence long before he saw its walls. Towns had a way of announcing themselves slowly, through subtle signs rather than sudden appearances. He listened to the sounds around him. The cartwheels spoke in soft, repetitive rhythms. The horse's breath rose and fell steadily. Birds crossed the sky above him without acknowledging his existence. The merchant did not feel ignored. He felt included in a larger quietness. Sometimes his thoughts wandered without direction. He remembered markets he had visited years ago, where the language sounded slightly different, where coins looked unfamiliar, where customs felt strange for a moment before becoming ordinary. At first, such differences had unsettled him. Over time, they had become part of the texture of his journeys. He recalled a distant town where the market square was smaller, almost shy, tucked between narrow buildings. People there spoke softly and smiled rarely. Yet they bought goods with careful hands, as if every object carried weight beyond its price. He wondered whether those people still walked the same streets, touching the same stones. The merchant understood that he would never know. Most of his connections were brief and incomplete. He entered lives at their edges and left before becoming central. Yet he did not feel disappointed by this. Edges, he had learned, were often more peaceful than centers as he traveled. He met a traveler walking in the opposite direction. The man wore a faded cloak and carried little more than a staff. They exchanged a few words about the road ahead and the weather behind. Their conversation felt light, almost weightless. When they parted, the merchant felt no loss. Encounters on the road were like reflections in water, visible for a moment, then gone. Hours passed in this way, not counted, not measured. The sun shifted gradually, drawing shadows across the path. The merchant noticed how his own shadow stretched beside him, sometimes long, sometimes short, never fixed. It seemed to belong to him, and yet not entirely. Eventually, the outlines of the next town appeared on the horizon. At first it was only a suggestion, a darker line against the sky, a cluster of shapes that might have been trees or walls. As he approached, the shapes became clearer. Stone towers rose gently above rooftops. Smoke drifted upward from unseen hearths. The merchant felt neither relief nor anticipation. Arrival was simply another phase of movement. He guided the horse toward the town gate with the same calm he had carried on the open road. Near the gate, guards stood quietly. Their presence was routine rather than threatening. They glanced at his cart, asked a few simple questions, and allowed him to pass. No ceremony marked his entrance. Towns received merchants the way rivers received water, without surprise. Inside the walls, the streets felt narrower than the open road. Sounds bounced off stone surfaces, creating a low murmur of activity. People moved with unhurried purpose. Some carried baskets, some led animals, some simply walked, their faces turned inward, as if thinking of things that could not be spoken aloud. The merchant guided his cart toward the market square. It was smaller than the one in his hometown, but familiar in spirit. Wooden stalls formed irregular lines. A few merchants had already arrived. Arranging their goods with quiet concentration, he found a place for his cart and began to unload his bundles. His hands moved slowly, almost thoughtfully. Each rope untied, each cloth unfolded, each object placed on the stall felt like part of a ritual that had been repeated countless times, across countless towns. Other merchants greeted him with nods and brief words. Their voices carried accents that differed slightly from his own. He listened without trying to analyze the differences. Variation felt natural here, like changes in the weather. As the market began to fill, the merchant observed people with the same quiet attention he had learned long ago. Faces here looked different from those in his hometown, yet their expressions felt familiar. Curiosity, caution, fatigue, quiet hope. These emotions traveled farther than goods ever could. A man approached his stall and examined a piece of cloth. He touched it carefully, then looked at the merchant as if searching for something unspoken. They discussed the price in low voices. The exchange felt less like negotiation and more like mutual acknowledgement. When the man finally paid, he did so slowly, as if marking the moment in his memory. The merchant accepted the coins without emotion. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel indifferent. He felt aligned with the flow of trade, as if he were neither buyer nor seller, but a point through which objects passed. As the afternoon deepened, the market became denser, then gradually calmer. Sounds rose and fell like distant waves. The merchant remained present within this shifting atmosphere, neither fully absorbed nor detached. He noticed how people here walked differently. Their steps were slightly quicker, their gestures slightly more restrained. He wondered if the rhythm of a town shaped the rhythm of its inhabitants, or if the reverse was true. The question drifted through his mind without demanding an answer. By late afternoon, he felt the familiar quiet tiredness that came not from effort, but from continuity. He sat briefly on the edge of his cart, letting his eyes rest on the movement around him. The town did not rush him. It seemed content to exist at its own pace, and as shadows began to lengthen across the market square, the merchant remained where he was. gently suspended between departure and arrival, between one town and another, between motion and stillness, carrying within him the slow, steady life of a medieval trader who had never needed to hurry. Evening arrived gradually, as if the day were reluctant to let go of itself. The light softened first, losing its sharpness, then its brightness, until colors seemed to melt quietly into one another. The merchant watched this change without commentary. He had seen it too many times to be surprised, yet not so many times that it became invisible. In the market square, people began to move differently. Their steps slowed, their voices lowered. Some stalls closed gently, cloths folded over goods like blankets placed on sleeping bodies. Others remained open a little longer, as if unsure whether the day was truly finished. The merchant felt the shift in atmosphere before he felt it in his body. He began to pack his remaining goods with the same careful gestures he had used earlier. Each motion felt familiar, almost soothing. He tied ropes slowly, not because he was tired, but because slowness felt appropriate. Nearby, a woman laughed softly with another merchant. The sound did not disturb the quiet. It seemed to belong to it. Somewhere else, a child called out to a parent. Somewhere else, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The town was not falling asleep yet, but it was beginning to dream. When his stall was ready to be left, the merchant stood still for a moment. He looked around the square without searching for anything in particular. Faces passed through his field of vision. Some he would never see again. Some he might meet years later without recognition. The thought did not trouble him. He led his cart through the narrowing streets toward a small inn near the edge of town. The horse followed obediently, its movements calm and unhurried. Lanterns flickered in doorways, their light trembling slightly in the evening air. Shadows stretched along walls, growing longer with every step. Inside the inn, the air felt warmer. Wooden tables bore marks of countless meals. The smell of soup and bread lingered quietly. Travelers sat in small groups, speaking in low voices. Their words formed a soft background murmur that required no attention. The merchant found a place to sit and ordered a simple meal. He ate slowly, tasting without analysis. Around him, conversations drifted from weather to roads to distant rumors. He listened without absorbing too much. Words, like goods, passed through him without staying long. Later, in a small room upstairs, he lay down on a narrow bed. The window beside him showed a fragment of the night sky. Somewhere below, footsteps moved, then faded. The town continued its quiet life without needing him. He did not reflect deeply on the day. He did not measure success or failure. He simply felt the gentle weight of continuity. Tomorrow would bring another market, another road, another series of small exchanges that would slowly shape his life. As sleep approached, his thoughts loosened. Images of roads, stalls, rivers, and faces drifted through his mind without order. None of them demanded meaning. They existed the way clouds existed in the sky, forming and dissolving without explanation. And while the town outside breathed softly in the darkness, the merchant allowed himself to become still, knowing that movement would return on its own, quietly, patiently, without ever needing to be called. The morning did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a fabric being unrolled across the world. The merchant woke before the inn became fully aware of itself. The wooden floorboards beneath him felt cool, as if they had been holding the night carefully and were reluctant to let it go. He lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet. Somewhere in the building, someone turned in sleep. Somewhere outside, a cart passed over stones with a muted rumble. These sounds did not interrupt his thoughts. They joined them. He rose without haste and dressed in familiar movements. His cloak rested on his shoulders with a weight that felt both physical and symbolic. It carried dust from many roads, faint traces of rain, and memories that did not ask to be remembered. Downstairs, the innkeeper moved slowly behind a counter, arranging cups and bowls as if each object needed to be reminded of its place. The merchant exchanged a few quiet words with him. Their voices were low, not because silence was required, but because loudness felt unnecessary. Outside, the town was waking again. The merchant stepped into the street and felt the air brush against his face. It was neither cold nor warm, but balanced, as if the world had decided not to lean too far in any direction. He walked toward the stable where his horse waited. The animal lifted its head slightly when it saw him, then returned to its quiet stillness. The merchant touched its neck with gentle familiarity, feeling the slow rhythm beneath its skin. Life, he thought, was mostly rhythm. He checked his cart, his ropes, his bundles. Nothing had changed overnight, yet he still looked, still touched, still confirmed. Assurance was not always about discovering something new. Sometimes it was about realizing that nothing had changed. When he began to move through the town, he felt the subtle difference between staying and leaving. Streets that had felt enclosed the night before now felt open, as if they were guiding him outward. He passed doorways, windows, wells, and walls that would soon become distant memories again. Beyond the town gate, the road welcomed him without ceremony. It did not ask where he had been or where he was going. It simply existed, stretching forward with quiet persistence as he walked. He noticed how the landscape changed, almost invisibly. Fields replaced houses, trees replaced walls, silence replaced voices. The world did not shift abruptly. It transitioned with the patience of something that had no reason to hurry. He thought about the nature of trade. Goods moved from hand to hand, town to town, region to region. Yet most people saw only the moment of exchange, not the long journey behind it. A piece of cloth appeared in a market stall, and few wondered how many roads it had traveled. The merchant felt himself to be part of that unseen journey. He was not the beginning or the end. He was one of many steps in between. This realization did not make him feel insignificant. It made him feel connected. As the sun rose higher, the road became brighter. Dust lifted under the cartwheels, then settled again. The merchant watched it rise and fall without irritation. Dust was simply another companion on the road. He met a group of travelers moving in the same direction. They walked beside him for a while, their pace close to his own. Their conversations were light, drifting from topic to topic without urgency. One spoke of a distant fair where musicians had played all night. Another spoke of rising prices in a coastal town. The merchant listened quietly when the group eventually turned onto another path. Their departure felt natural. Roads were full of temporary alliances. People joined and separated like streams, dividing and rejoining. He continued alone for a while, accompanied only by the horse and the cart. Solitude did not feel heavy. it felt spacious. In that space, his thoughts slowed further, spreading out like ripples on still water. He remembered a time when he had feared being alone on the road. Bandits, storms, unknown dangers had filled his imagination. Over the years, fear had softened into awareness. Dangers existed, but they were not constant. Most journeys were quiet. Most days passed without incident. He realized that the ordinary nature of his life was its most striking feature. Histories were often written about wars, kings, and disasters. Yet beneath those dramatic events, countless merchants, farmers, and travelers continued their routines without interruption. He wondered briefly whether anyone would ever remember him. The thought did not disturb him. Forgetting seemed natural. What mattered was not being remembered, but continuing. Around midday, he reached a gentle rise in the road. From there, he could see a wide stretch of land ahead. Fields extended toward the horizon, dotted with small villages and distant towers. The view did not inspire awe. It inspired steadiness. He stopped the cart for a moment and stood quietly. The wind moved through grass, creating waves that traveled without sound. The horse shifted its weight slightly, then became still again. The merchant felt a subtle sense of belonging, not to a single town or road, but to the slow movement of life itself. He did not feel heroic. He did not feel trapped. He felt present. After a while, he resumed his journey. The wheels turned again. The horse stepped forward. The road accepted him once more. And as he moved through the wide, unhurried landscape, the medieval world continued to unfold around him, not as a stage for great events, but as a quiet, continuous space where ordinary lives flowed gently forward, one slow step at a time. The road stretched forward with a calm persistence that felt almost kind. It did not twist suddenly or rise sharply. It simply continued, as if it had always known where it was going, even if the merchant did not. He walked beside the cart with an easy rhythm. His steps did not try to match the horse's pace exactly. Instead, they found their own quiet balance. Sometimes he held the reins loosely. Sometimes he let them rest against his hand without thought. Control and surrender blended so naturally that he could not say where one ended and the other began. The air shifted as the day moved forward. It carried faint traces of grass, distant smoke, and something else he could not name. Smells on the road were never fixed. They came and went like visitors who never stayed long enough to be questioned. He noticed how the light changed color as clouds passed overhead. Shadows appeared, disappeared, then returned in slightly altered forms. The world seemed to be constantly adjusting itself, making small corrections that no one had asked for. Occasionally, he heard sounds from far away. The faint ringing of a bell from a village hidden beyond a hill, the distant bark of a dog, the muffled voices of people he would never meet. These sounds did not interrupt his journey. They accompanied it like quiet reminders that he was not alone in the world. He thought again of towns. Each town had its own rhythm, its own way of holding people together. Some felt tight and enclosed, their streets narrow and their voices close. Others felt open and scattered, their markets wide and their conversations stretched thin across space. Yet beneath these differences, the same patterns repeated: buying, selling, waiting, leaving. He wondered whether people in those towns thought about merchants the way he thought about them. Perhaps to them, he was only a passing figure, a face that appeared briefly and disappeared again. They might remember his goods more clearly than his name. The thought did not trouble him. He had learned that objects often outlived their carriers. A piece of cloth might remain in a household for years, while the merchant who sold it would fade into anonymity. In this way, trade felt almost like a quiet form of immortality. As he walked, he remembered an old woman he had once met in a distant market. She had spoken slowly, choosing her words with care, as if language was something fragile. She had bought a simple object from him, nothing rare or expensive. Yet she had held it for a long moment before paying, as if it carried a story only she could see. He had never known what that story was. He had never seen her again. Yet the memory lingered faintly, like a shadow that refused to disappear completely. The road began to slope gently downward. The merchant allowed the cart to roll more freely, guiding it with minimal effort. The horse seemed to sense the change in terrain and adjusted its pace without instruction. Animals, he thought, understood movement in ways humans often forgot. At the bottom of the slope, the landscape opened into a wide plain. Wind moved across it freely, unimpeded by trees or walls. The merchant felt the breeze touch his face and cloak, lifting the fabric slightly. For a moment, he felt lighter, as if the road were carrying him rather than the other way around. He passed a small farmhouse set far from any town. Smoke rose lazily from its chimney. A figure stood near the doorway, watching the road without expectation. Their eyes met briefly, then drifted away. No greeting was exchanged. The moment was complete without words. He realized that many such moments filled his life. Brief encounters, passing glances, shared silence. None of them lasted long, yet together they formed a quiet tapestry of connection. As the afternoon progressed, he began to feel the subtle fatigue that came from steady movement rather than strain. His body did not protest. It simply suggested rest. He listened to it with the same calm attention he gave to weather and roads. Near a cluster of low hills, he slowed the cart and stopped beside a patch of grass. The horse lowered its head to graze. The merchant sat on a stone and let his thoughts loosen. From this vantage point, the world seemed wide and uncomplicated. Hills rose gently in the distance. Clouds drifted above them without urgency. No town. Walls enclosed the horizon. No market voices filled the air. He wondered how many people lived their entire lives without leaving their villages. For them, the world might feel small but secure. For him, it felt large but familiar. Neither seemed better. Both felt necessary. He drank a little water and watched the horse chew slowly. Time stretched outward, almost dissolving. There was no clear boundary between minutes and hours. There was only continuation. After a while, he stood again, not reluctantly, not eagerly. He returned to the cart and resumed his journey. The wheels began their quiet song once more. The road welcomed him back without comment, and as he moved forward through the open plain, the merchant felt himself carried gently by a life that did not demand excitement or meaning. Only patience and presence, only the willingness to keep. Walking through a world that rarely hurried and never fully stopped. The light began to change again, almost without warning. It did not fade suddenly. It softened first, as if the day was slowly exhaling. The merchant noticed the shift not with thought, but with feeling. His eyes adjusted. His steps grew slightly slower. The world around him seemed to lean gently. Toward evening, the road continued ahead, but it no longer felt endless. It felt settled, as if it had already decided how far it would carry him today. He did not question this. Roads, he believed, often knew more than travelers did as he walked. The landscape grew quieter. Birds called less frequently. The wind lost some of its strength. Even the horse seemed to sense the approaching stillness and moved with a softer rhythm. The cart wheels turned with a steady, muted sound that felt almost like breathing. He passed. Another small cluster of houses, barely a village, barely a name on anyone's map. A few children stood near a fence, watching him with idle curiosity. Their faces were open, unguarded, as if they had not yet learned that most travelers were temporary. The merchant nodded slightly as he passed. The children did not follow him. They returned to their own quiet games. He thought about how many places he had seen like this. Villages that did not appear in stories. Houses that did not appear in records. People who lived, worked, and disappeared without leaving marks that history would notice. Yet these places felt real in a way that grand castles and crowded cities sometimes did not. The merchant understood that his own life belonged more to these quiet spaces than to dramatic ones. He did not move through palaces or battlefields. He moved through fields, roads, markets, and inns. His world was built from small interactions and slow journeys. As the afternoon drifted toward its end, he began to sense the weight of the day settling gently on his body. His legs felt heavier, but not strained. His shoulders felt warm beneath the cloak. His mind felt wide and slightly distant, as if it had wandered ahead of him along the road. He did not resist this feeling. He had learned that tiredness was not an enemy. It was simply a sign that time had passed. Ahead, he noticed a familiar shape on the horizon. A line of trees. A faint suggestion of rooftops. Another town, not far now. He did not feel excitement at the thought of arrival. He felt something quieter, like recognition. As he approached, details slowly emerged. A low wall, a gate, smoke rising from chimneys. The town did not announce itself loudly. It waited. He slowed the cart slightly, allowing the moment of approach to stretch. There was something gentle about the space between travel and arrival. Once inside a town, he would become a merchant again, a seller of goods, a participant in conversations. On the road, he had been something else, something harder to name. Near the gate, a man stood leaning against a wooden post, watching travelers pass. The merchant met his gaze briefly. There was no challenge in it, no particular interest, just acknowledgement. The merchant nodded and continued forward. Inside the town, streets curved unpredictably, shaped by centuries of footsteps rather than plans. Houses leaned toward one another, their walls carrying layers of time. The merchant guided his cart through narrow passages where echoes lingered longer than voices. He felt the town's rhythm slowly replace the rhythm of the road. Sounds became denser, smells became richer, human presence pressed closer. Yet the town did not feel overwhelming. It felt contained, like a bowl holding many quiet lives. He did not go directly to the market. Instead, he wandered a little, letting the town reveal itself gradually. He passed a well where two women spoke in low voices. He passed a workshop where a man hammered metal with steady, unhurried strikes. He passed a doorway where a cat slept. Indifferent to everything, eventually. He reached a small open square where a few merchants had already begun to set up their stalls for the next day. He stopped his cart and stood still for a moment. He felt neither arrival nor departure fully. He felt suspension. He imagined tomorrow's market, the slow unfolding of goods, the cautious approach of buyers, the quiet exchanges of coins and words. He imagined it not with anticipation, but with acceptance. Tomorrow was not a promise. It was simply a continuation. As evening settled further, lanterns began to glow in windows. Their light was not bright but warm. Shadows gathered in corners, not threatening, just present. The merchant led his horse toward a modest stable and secured the cart. When he finished, he stood beside the horse for a moment longer than necessary. He rested his hand against its neck, feeling the warmth beneath the skin. The animal breathed. Slowly. The merchant breathed slowly too. He felt the day loosen its hold on him. The road receded into memory. The town moved closer. Somewhere inside him, movement and stillness met quietly. As he walked toward a nearby din, his steps were unhurried, almost drifting. The world around him did not ask for decisions. It simply existed, offering itself without insistence. And in that gentle, ordinary moment, the medieval merchant continued his life, not with ambition or urgency, but with a quiet willingness to move from road to town, from town to road, from one slow day to the next, carried forward by a world that never rushed and never fully stopped, only flowed softly and endlessly through time. The night had not fully released its grip when the merchant opened his eyes. Darkness still lingered in the corners of the room, but a faint softness in the air suggested that morning was approaching. He lay quietly for a moment, feeling the stillness around him, feeling the slow rhythm of his own breath. The inn was quiet at this hour. Wooden beams above him seemed to hold the silence gently, as if they had learned how to keep secrets over many years. Somewhere in the building, a floorboard creaked softly, then settled again. The sound felt distant, like a memory rather than an event. He sat up slowly, letting the world come into focus without forcing it. His body felt familiar to him, neither light nor heavy, simply present. He reached for his cloak and felt its worn fabric beneath his fingers. It was marked by many journeys, yet it still served its purpose without complaint. Downstairs, the innkeeper was already awake. A small fire burned in the hearth, its glow faint but steady. The merchant exchanged a quiet greeting and accepted a simple cup of warm drink. He held it in his hands for a moment, feeling the heat travel slowly into his palms. Outside, the town was beginning its subtle transformation from night to day. Doors were still closed, but not tightly. Windows held traces of light. The merchant stepped into the street and listened. The silence was not empty. It was filled with expectation, though no one seemed aware of it. He walked toward the stable where his horse waited. The animal stood calmly, its presence steady and patient. The merchant stroked its neck and felt the gentle movement beneath its skin. He did not speak. Words would have added nothing. He checked the cart again, as he always did. Ropes were tightened. Bundles were counted. Objects rested where they should. Nothing had changed. Yet he still looked, still touched, still confirmed. Repetition did not bore him. It anchored him. Today, he would remain in this town longer than usual. There was no pressing need to leave. The market here was steady, not large, but reliable. He felt no desire to chase distant opportunities. Sometimes, staying felt more natural than moving. As he guided the cart toward the marketplace, the town slowly awakened around him. A baker opened a door and carried trays of bread into the cool air. A woman drew water from a well. A man swept dust from his doorway with slow, unhurried strokes. The market square appeared ahead, quiet but ready. Wooden stalls waited like patient structures, shaped by countless days of trade. The merchant found a familiar place and began to unload his goods. He unfolded cloth with deliberate movements, smoothing wrinkles with his hands. He arranged objects not to attract attention, but to create a sense of calm. Order felt more important than display. He believed that people were more likely to approach what felt stable. Other merchants arrived one by one. They greeted each other with nods rather than enthusiasm. Their voices were low, their gestures restrained. They were not competitors in a dramatic sense. They were companions in routine. As the sun rose higher, the market slowly filled with life. People entered the square without haste. Some came to buy. Some came simply to walk and observe. Children wandered between stalls, touching objects with curiosity. Elderly people sat on low benches, watching movement as if it were a kind of story. The merchant stood behind his stall, not calling out to customers, not urging them to buy. He waited. Waiting was not passive for him. It was a form of participation. By being present, he allowed the world to approach him on its own terms. A man stopped before his stall and examined a piece of cloth. The merchant watched quietly. The man touched the fabric, held it against the light, then looked up slowly. Their eyes met briefly. They spoke a few words about price, about quality, about nothing in particular. When the man finally made his purchase, the exchange felt almost ceremonial. Coins changed hands. Cloth changed ownership. Both men nodded slightly, as if acknowledging something beyond the transaction. After the man left, the merchant remained still for a moment. He felt no surge of satisfaction. He felt only continuity. Trade was not a series of victories. It was a slow conversation between needs and possibilities. The morning continued its gentle unfolding. The market grew denser, then relaxed again. Sounds rose and fell like quiet waves. The merchant listened without focusing on any single voice. He noticed how people moved through the square with different rhythms. Some walked quickly, as if time pressed against them. Others walked slowly, as if time was something they carried lightly. He wondered which rhythm belonged to him. Perhaps he belonged somewhere in between. And as the day settled into its steady pace, the medieval merchant remained where he was, quietly observing the flow of ordinary lives, feeling himself neither separate from them nor fully merged with them, but gently suspended in the calm, unremarkable space where trade, time, and human presence met without urgency. The market continued to breathe in its own quiet way. It did not rush toward fullness, nor did it resist emptiness. It simply existed between the two, expanding and contracting with gentle inevitability. The merchant felt this rhythm not as sound, but as atmosphere, as if the air itself were moving slowly around him. He stood behind his stall without tension. His hands rested lightly on the wooden surface, fingers touching the grain of the wood as if it were a familiar language. He did not watch people with intensity. He allowed them to enter his awareness the way clouds entered the sky. A woman approached, carrying a basket lined with cloth. Her steps were measured, her gaze calm. She did not look directly at the goods at first. Instead, she looked around the square, as if orienting herself within the moment. Only then did her eyes settle on the merchant's stall. She picked up a small object, turned it in her hands, and waited. The merchant did not speak immediately. Silence felt more natural than interruption. When they finally spoke, their voices were low, almost tentative. The exchange was brief. Coins changed hands. The woman placed the object carefully in her basket and walked away without looking back. The merchant watched her disappear into the movement of the crowd. He did not wonder where she was going. He had learned that questions often led nowhere. Acceptance, on the other hand, led everywhere. Time passed with such subtlety that it was difficult to notice its movement. Shadows shifted across the square. Light softened at the edges of objects. The merchant felt hunger arrive quietly, not as a demand, but as a suggestion. When the crowd thinned slightly, he ate a small piece of bread, chewing slowly, tasting without thought. Nearby, other merchants moved in similar rhythms. Some spoke more than he did. Some laughed softly. Some stared at their goods with expressions that suggested calculation. Yet beneath these differences, they shared a common stillness. They had all learned that markets rewarded patience more than speed. The merchant remembered a time when he had tried to hurry. Years ago, he had traveled faster than necessary, pushed his horse harder than was wise, chased rumors of higher prices in distant towns. He had arrived exhausted and uncertain, only to discover that the market there was no different from the one he had left. Since then, he had learned to move slowly. Slowness was not weakness, it was clarity. A group of children ran through the square, their laughter rising briefly above the murmurs of adults. They wove between stalls, chased each other in loose circles, and disappeared again near the far end of the market. The merchant watched them with faint curiosity. Their energy felt distant from his own life, yet strangely familiar, as if he were remembering something that belonged to another person. He wondered briefly what kind of life awaited them. Some might become farmers, some craftsmen, some travelers. Perhaps one of them would become a merchant someday, standing behind a stall in a market not yet built. The thought did not excite him. It felt simply logical. As midday approached, the square grew warmer. People moved more slowly. Conversations stretched longer. The merchant felt the heat settle gently on his shoulders. He adjusted his cloak and continued to stand quietly. A man he had seen in previous days approached again. This time, the man did not touch the goods immediately. He stood for a moment, as if unsure whether to speak. The merchant waited when they spoke. Their words were not about prices. They spoke of roads, of distant towns, of bridges that had collapsed and been rebuilt. Their conversation felt less like trade and more like shared observation. When the man finally left, he did not buy anything. The merchant did not feel disappointed. He understood that not every encounter needed to produce a result. Sometimes, presence was enough. The afternoon drifted forward with the same gentle persistence. The merchant felt neither bored nor engaged. He felt balanced. Each moment passed without demanding meaning. He noticed how the market's sounds gradually changed. Voices softened slightly. Footsteps became less frequent. The air seemed to hold more pauses between movements. These changes were not abrupt. They unfolded the way twilight unfolded across the sky. He began to pack a few items that were unlikely to sell today. His hands moved with quiet precision. Folding cloth felt almost meditative. Tying ropes felt like closing small chapters that would reopen tomorrow. Other merchants began similar preparations. Some left early, some lingered. No one announced their departure. They simply faded from the square, one by one, like thoughts dissolving in the mind. The merchant looked around again. The market was still alive, but its energy had shifted. It felt less like a gathering and more like a memory in formation. He felt no urgency to leave. He felt no urgency to stay. He remained where he was, suspended between action and rest. And as the afternoon slowly leaned toward evening, the medieval merchant continued his quiet existence within the marketplace, not as a central figure, not as a spectator, but as something in between, a steady presence in a world that moved gently around him, asking nothing, promising nothing, and continuing endlessly in its calm, unremarkable flow. The light began to lose its sharpness, as if the day was slowly releasing its grip on the world. The merchant noticed this not with thought, but with sensation. The edges of objects softened. Colors became quieter. The market seemed to breathe more slowly. He stood behind his stall for a while longer, not because he expected new customers, but because leaving felt unnecessary. The square was still alive, yet its energy had shifted into something gentler, something closer to rest and activity. A man passed by carrying a bundle of firewood on his back. A woman walked slowly with a child who held her hand without speaking. Two merchants at a nearby stall spoke in low voices, their words dissolving into the air before they could form clear shapes. The merchant listened to these sounds without focusing on any of them. He felt a subtle tiredness in his body, not heavy, not unpleasant, but steady. It was the tiredness that came from being present for a long time, from standing in one place while the world flowed around him. He welcomed the feeling. It reminded him that the day had truly existed. He began to pack the remaining goods with deliberate care. Cloth folded into itself like quiet thoughts being put away. Small objects found their places inside boxes. Ropes tightened gently around bundles. Each movement felt slow enough to be noticed, yet familiar enough to require no effort as he worked. He remembered other evenings in other towns, markets closing under different skies, voices fading in different accents, lanterns glowing in slightly different colors. Yet beneath these differences, the same pattern always appeared. Activity softened. People withdrew into homes and inns. The world narrowed itself into smaller, warmer spaces. When his stall was finally empty, he stood still for a moment. The wooden surface beneath his hands felt cool now. The square looked wider than it had earlier, not because it had changed, but because fewer people remained within it. He did not feel loneliness. He felt clarity. He led his cart slowly through the streets. The horse followed without hesitation, its hooves making soft sounds against the stones. Houses leaned toward the road as if listening. Windows glowed faintly from within, holding private worlds that the merchant would never enter. He passed a doorway where a family sat around a small table. Their voices were low, their gestures slow. He passed a workshop where a craftsman was still working, hammer rising and falling in steady rhythm. He passed a well where no one stood now, its water reflecting the darkening sky. The inn appeared ahead, modest and familiar. Inside, warmth waited quietly. He guided the horse to the stable and secured the cart with gentle hands. He stayed beside the animal for a moment, resting his palm against its neck, feeling the slow movement of breath beneath skin. He felt no urge to hurry indoors. The evening air was cool and still. The sky above the town held no drama, only gradual darkness. Stars began to appear, one by one, without announcement. Eventually, he entered the inn. The room inside was filled with soft murmurs and the faint clatter of cups and plates. Travelers sat at tables, their faces tired but calm. Some spoke of roads and weather. Some sat in silence. The merchant found a place to sit and ordered a simple meal. He ate slowly. He did not think about the taste of the food. He thought about the rhythm of chewing, the quiet movement of his hands, the steady presence of the table before him. Around him, conversations drifted like distant currents, never demanding his attention. Later, in a small room upstairs, he lay on a narrow bed. The wooden walls held the day's warmth. Outside the window, the town was nearly silent. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once. Somewhere closer, a door closed gently. He did not review the day in his mind. He did not count sales or measure success. He allowed impressions to rise and fade on their own. Images of cloth, coins, faces, roads, and shadows drifted through his thoughts without order. He felt himself slowly separating from movement. The market receded. The streets became distant. The road beyond the town faded into abstraction. What remained was a quiet sense of continuity. Tomorrow would come, another market would open, another road would stretch outward, another sequence of small exchanges would begin. None of this felt urgent. None of it felt dramatic. It felt inevitable. As sleep approached, the merchant's breathing slowed. The world outside continued its gentle rhythm without him. Time moved forward without asking permission, and in the quiet space between waking and sleep, the medieval merchant rested not in triumph or defeat, but in the simple certainty that life would continue to flow slowly around him, just as it always had, carrying him forward without hurry, without noise, and without ever needing to explain itself. The morning arrived quietly, almost shyly, as if it were uncertain whether anyone was ready to receive it. The merchant opened his eyes before the town fully awakened. The room around him felt suspended between night and day, holding both darkness and faint light at once. He remained still for a while, listening. The inn was not yet busy. Floorboards did not creak. Voices did not rise. Only the soft sound of air moving through unseen spaces filled the silence. It felt like the world was breathing slowly, carefully. Without urgency, he sat up and touched the edge of the bed, feeling the texture of wood beneath his fingers. His body felt neither rested nor exhausted, but balanced, as if it had learned how to exist comfortably within repetition. He reached for his cloak and placed it around his shoulders with familiar ease. Downstairs, the innkeeper moved quietly, arranging simple objects with deliberate care. The merchant greeted him with a nod and accepted a small cup of warm drink. He held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the warmth seep slowly into his palms. He did not hurry to drink it. Outside, the town was beginning its subtle transformation. Doors opened gradually. Windows caught faint light. A faint line of smoke rose from chimneys. The merchant stepped into the street and felt the cool morning air touch his face. It was neither sharp nor gentle. It simply existed. He walked toward the stable where his horse waited. The animal stood calmly, its presence steady and patient. The merchant touched its neck and felt the slow rhythm beneath the skin. He did not speak. Words felt unnecessary. He checked the cart again, though he already knew everything was in place. Ropes were secure. Bundles were balanced. Objects rested quietly in their assigned spaces. The act of checking felt less like caution and more like ritual. Today, he would travel again. The town had offered no reason to stay longer, and no reason to leave sooner. Movement was simply the next natural step. He guided the horse toward the gate with slow, unhurried gestures. As he passed through the town's narrow streets, he felt the familiar sensation of departure. Buildings seemed to lean slightly away from him now, as if they had already begun to forget his presence. He did not resist this feeling. Leaving was as natural as arriving. Beyond the gate, the road opened once more. Fields stretched outward. Trees stood at quiet distances from one another. The sky above was wide and untroubled. The merchant stepped onto the road with the same calm acceptance he had felt on many journeys before. The horse moved forward steadily. The cartwheels began their gentle rhythm. The merchant walked beside them, his steps falling into a familiar pattern. The world around him did not change dramatically. It shifted slowly, like a landscape turning in sleep. He noticed how the air felt different beyond the town walls. Less crowded, less shaped by human presence. Sounds traveled farther here. A bird's call lingered longer. The rustle of grass felt more pronounced. He thought briefly about destinations. He did not imagine them vividly. He knew roughly where he was going, but he did not picture the town in detail. What mattered was not the place itself, but the gradual movement toward it. He remembered other roads. Roads that had felt narrower, darker, more uncertain. Roads that had been lined with forests where sunlight barely touched the ground. Roads that had passed through valleys where echoes seemed to follow travelers like unseen companions. Over time, he had learned that no road was entirely friendly or entirely hostile. Each road carried its own quiet personality. Some were gentle, some were stubborn, some were forgettable. Yet all of them eventually led somewhere. As the sun rose higher, the merchant felt warmth settle on his shoulders. He adjusted his cloak slightly, letting the air move more freely. The horse responded to subtle changes in terrain without instruction. The cart followed obediently. He encountered another traveler walking in the opposite direction. The man carried a sack over his shoulder and looked tired but calm. They exchanged a brief greeting. Their words were few, their understanding immediate. They continued in opposite directions without hesitation. The merchant felt no curiosity about the man's destination. He felt no need to share his own. Roads allowed people to meet without binding them together. There was a quiet freedom in that. As the morning progressed, the merchant's thoughts became less structured. He did not actively think about trade, profit, or plans. He allowed his mind to wander gently, like the road itself. He felt himself becoming less a person with ambitions and more a moving presence within the landscape. Step by step, wheel by wheel, breath by breath. He moved forward through a world that neither hurried him nor held him back. And as the medieval morning continued to unfold around him, the merchant remained within its slow rhythm, neither ahead of it nor behind it, simply traveling quietly and steadily through a life shaped not by dramatic moments, but by endless, gentle movement across familiar roads. The road accepted the merchant without question. It did not react to his presence. It did not change its shape to accommodate him. It simply continued forward, carrying him along its quiet length with the same patience. It had shown countless travelers before him. He walked beside the cart with a steady rhythm that required no effort. His body had learned the language of travel so deeply that movement felt less like action and more like continuation. The horse's hooves touched the ground in slow, measured beats. The wheels turned with a sound that felt almost familiar enough to be forgotten. The landscape around him unfolded gradually. Fields extended outward in muted shades of green and brown. Low hills rose in the distance, their edges softened by haze. Trees stood alone or in small groups, their branches barely moving in the light breeze. Nothing demanded attention. Everything invited quiet observation. He noticed small details without trying to. A stone half bare beside the road. A bird perched on a fence post, watching nothing in particular. A patch of wildflowers growing where no one had planted them. These things did not change his journey, yet they accompanied it like silent companions. Walking beside him, sometimes he felt that the road itself was a kind of memory. Each curve seemed shaped by countless footsteps. Each worn section of earth seemed to hold the weight of years. He wondered how many merchants had walked here before him, carrying goods similar to his own, feeling thoughts similar to his own. Believing their journeys were ordinary, he suspected they were right. As the sun climbed higher, the air grew warmer. The merchant loosened his cloak slightly and let it fall more freely around his shoulders. He did not hurry the horse. Speed felt unnecessary. Arriving sooner would not make the destination richer. He met a small group of farmers walking toward a nearby village. Their clothes were dusty. Their faces were calm. They spoke quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing at the cart. When they passed, they exchanged brief greetings. Their voices carried no curiosity, no suspicion, only acknowledgement. The merchant continued forward. Encounters like these felt natural. People touched each other's lives for moments, then drifted apart again, leaving no trace except faint impressions that slowly dissolved. He thought about trade in a wider sense. Goods moved along roads like these every day. Cloth traveled from weaving towns to distant markets. Salt moved from coasts to inland villages. Metal tools passed from forges to farms. Yet most people never saw the entire journey. They saw only the moment when an object arrived in their hands. He wondered whether he himself was seen in the same way. To some, he was only a passing merchant. To others, he was a familiar face in a market. To himself, he was simply someone who moved. The road began to curve gently through a stretch of open land. Wind moved across the grass in slow waves. The merchant felt the breeze brush against his face. It carried no urgency, no message. It simply existed, touching everything. Without discrimination, he allowed his thoughts to loosen further. Memories drifted through his mind without order. A market where he had once stood beneath heavy rain. A bridge he had crossed in silence at dawn. An inn where travelers had spoken of distant lands with voices half awake. None of these memories felt sharp. They felt softened by time, like stones rounded by water. At midday, he slowed near a shallow bend in the road where a small tree offered shade. He stopped the cart and allowed the horse to rest. The animal lowered its head and grazed quietly. The merchant sat on the ground and leaned against the trunk of the tree. The earth beneath him felt cool. Above him, leaves filtered sunlight into broken patterns. He ate a small piece of bread, chewing slowly, without appetite or reluctance. Hunger, like everything else, arrived gently and departed gently. He watched the road while he rested. Travelers passed occasionally, moving in both directions. Some walked quickly, as if they had somewhere urgent to be. Others moved slowly, as if time had little meaning for them. The merchant felt himself closer to the second group. He realized that his life was not shaped by dramatic turning points. It was shaped by accumulation. One day added to another. One road added to another. One market added to another. Over time, these small additions created something that felt solid, though it had never been built intentionally. After a while, he stood again. There was no clear signal that it was time to move. He simply felt that remaining still had completed its purpose. He returned to the cart, adjusted the ropes, and guided the horse forward. The road welcomed him back with the same indifference it had always shown. The wheels resumed their quiet rhythm. The merchant resumed his steady walk. As the afternoon advanced, the light began to shift slightly. Shadows stretched longer across the land. The air softened. The merchant felt himself moving not only through space, but through time. Carried by a current that required no effort to follow. He did not think about where he would sleep that night. He did not imagine tomorrow in detail. He allowed the present moment to expand gently around him. And as he continued along the road, neither hurried nor delayed, the medieval merchant remained what he had always been, a quiet figure moving through an ordinary world, carrying goods, memories, and moments from one place to another, without drama, without urgency, and without ever fully noticing how far he had already traveled. The afternoon leaned slowly toward evening, though it did not announce the change. The light softened first, then thinned, as if the sun were quietly loosening its hold on the land. The merchant noticed this shift, not with thought, but with a subtle feeling in his body. His steps grew slightly slower. The air felt less bright, more spacious. The road continued beneath his feet with the same quiet patience. It did not respond to the changing sky. It did not shorten or lengthen itself. It simply remained what it had always been, a line of earth shaped by countless journeys, carrying travelers without asking who they were or where they were going. He walked beside the cart, his hand resting lightly on the reins. The horse moved with steady calm, as if it, too, understood that there was no need to hurry. The wheels turned with a sound that felt almost like breathing. Each rotation felt familiar, predictable, reassuring. He passed through a stretch of land, where fields slowly gave way to scattered trees. Shadows gathered beneath branches, forming quiet pools of darkness. The merchant felt the temperature change slightly as he entered these shaded areas. The difference was small, but noticeable. Like a gentle reminder, the world was never entirely uniform. In the distance, he saw faint signs of human presence. a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere beyond the trees. A narrow path branching off the main road, worn by feet that had chosen a different direction. He did not follow it. He remained on his own road, not out of determination, but out of habit. He thought briefly about choice. Many people believed that life was shaped by large decisions, yet his own life felt shaped more by quiet continuations than by dramatic choices. He did not remember a moment when he had decided to become a merchant. It seemed as if the role had simply grown around him, slowly and naturally. As the light continued to fade, the world felt less defined. Colors softened, edges blurred slightly. The merchant felt himself becoming part of this softness. His thoughts lost their sharpness. They became more like impressions than ideas. He passed another traveler, walking in the same direction. The man walked a little faster, carrying a bundle over his shoulder. They exchanged a brief glance and a few quiet words. Neither asked questions, neither offered explanations. After a few moments, the traveler moved ahead, gradually becoming smaller in the distance. The merchant felt no need to follow or to fall behind. Distance between people felt natural, not painful. Eventually, the road began to curve gently toward a small cluster of buildings visible ahead. A village, modest and unremarkable. Its rooftops caught the last traces of sunlight. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys. The merchant did not feel excitement at the sight of it. He felt recognition. He slowed the cart slightly, allowing the approach to stretch. Approaching a town always felt like crossing an invisible boundary between movement and pause. On the road, he belonged to distance. In towns, he belonged to exchange. As he entered the village, the sounds changed. The open quiet of fields gave way to the muffled closeness of human life. Footsteps echoed faintly on stone. Voices drifted from behind walls. A dog barked once, then fell silent. He guided the horse through narrow streets where houses leaned toward one another like old companions. Lanterns glowed softly in doorways. Windows held warm light that suggested dinners, conversations, and small domestic worlds. He found a simple inn near the edge of the village. The stable beside it was quiet, its wooden beams dark with age. He led the horse inside and secured the cart with careful hands. For a moment, he stood beside the animal, resting his palm against its neck. He felt the slow rhythm of breath beneath his hand. It felt grounding, almost meditative. Inside the inn, the air was warm and subdued. A few travelers sat at tables, their voices low. The merchant took a seat in a corner and ordered a modest meal. He ate slowly, without hunger or indulgence, simply following the rhythm of the moment. Around him, conversations rose and fell gently. Someone spoke of a road that had flooded after heavy rain. Someone else mentioned a fair in a distant town. The merchant listened without attachment. These stories did not change his path. They existed like distant landmarks he might never reach. Later, he climbed a narrow staircase to a small room. The bed was simple. The walls were plain. A single window revealed a fragment of the night sky. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the days settle inside him. He did not review his journey in detail. He did not count distances or profits. He allowed images to drift through his mind. Fields, roads, markets, faces, shadows. None of them demanded meaning. They were simply traces of movement. As he lay down, The village outside grew quieter. Sounds faded one by one. Somewhere, a door closed softly. Somewhere, footsteps disappeared. The world narrowed into stillness. His breathing slowed. The road receded from his awareness. The cart, the horse, the markets all became distant shapes. In a mind growing quiet, tomorrow would come without asking him. Another road would stretch outward. Another town would appear beyond the horizon. He did not need to plan for it. Continuation would arrive on its own, and as sleep gently closed around him, the medieval merchant rested not in accomplishment or failure, but in the simple, unremarkable truth of his life, that he would wake again, move again, trade again, and continue walking through a world that never hurried him and never stopped, carrying him forward with the same slow, patient rhythm that had guided him for as long as he could remember.